If we are one, what does the concept of metacognition mean? How can it help to move us towards spiritual awakening? In our last episode, we talked about gaining a deeper understanding of something that I have spoken about and referenced throughout our podcast. That is, what is oneness consciousness? But if we are one, how does the idea of metacognition help us in our quest for personal growth, understanding, and spiritual enlightenment? How can this help us wake up into the realization of ourselves as spiritual beings, and more importantly, unique and aware perspectives of the one, of all that is itself? Hi, I'm Darrell T. Johnson, a musician, a teacher, and a QHHT hypnosis practitioner. I'd like to welcome all of you to episode 21 of If We Are One. Hello everyone, and welcome to this episode. Today I would like to talk about something called metacognition. In many academic circles, it has been touted as the highest form of intelligence because it is the art of thinking about thinking, becoming the observer who is observing their mind, feeling, and emotions in real time. So let's get a better understanding of this and how it relates to spiritual evolution and the understanding of one's self. Metacognition is usually defined as the ability to notice, reflect on, and intentionally guide your thoughts, emotions, and mental habits in real time. In simpler terms, it is the awareness of what is happening in me right now, plus the capacity to work with it instead of being run by it. So you can think of it in two broad parts. The first is awareness, noticing your thoughts, emotional reactions, and impulses as events in the mind, as in, I'm telling myself a catastrophic story. I'm starting to get defensive. I'm assuming I already know the answer, etc., etc., etc. The second is regulation, being able to pause, question, and redirect them. Is that story actually true? Or what else could this mean? Or how do I want to respond instead of just react? In everyday life, metacognition shows up when you catch yourself in a mental loop and step out of it. You realize mid-conversation that you're getting triggered and choose to soften instead of attack or withdraw. You may notice that your current state of seeing something is narrow or biased, and you consciously widen the frame. This is why some people call it a highest form of intelligence. It's the intelligence that operates on your other intelligences. It doesn't just think, it supervises thinking. You can think of it as the connection to self-understanding. Metacognition is one of the main engines of genuine self-knowledge because it reveals patterns you normally run on autopilot. It exposes your core beliefs. I'm not good enough, or people can't be trusted, or I must be in control, instead of letting them operate unconsciously. It highlights your default emotional strategies: pleasing, avoiding, attacking, numbing, as patterns, not as just the way things are. It also lets you see your biases and blind spots, like always assuming the worst or always assuming you're to blame. Without this reflective capacity, we confuse our inner commentary with reality itself. With it, you start to experience, oh, this is not the truth. This is my mind's current interpretation. That shift is the doorway to deeper self-understanding. Here's a simple example. If you text someone and they don't reply, your mind might go, they're ignoring me. I must have done something wrong. Metacognition is the part of you that notices this story and can ask, what else could be true? Why did I jump to that conclusion? Does this connect to earlier experiences of rejection? That inquiry is self-knowledge in action. I'll give you another example. In my own experience, I have noticed that there are some people who seem to continually look for reasons to get angry. I have long ago lived under the motto, don't sweat the small stuff. But I sometimes encounter individuals who constantly get triggered by the small stuff. They seem to be caught up in an anger loop, waiting for their next trigger event. So how might this notion be considered from the standpoint of metacognition? From a metacognitive standpoint, what we are noticing looks like people having very limited awareness of how their own thinking and emotional processes are working in the moment, and then getting run by those processes instead of choosing how to respond. Remember, metacognition is thinking about thinking. The ability to notice your own thoughts, beliefs, and emotional states, and to evaluate how accurate or helpful they are. Applied to emotion, people sometimes call this meta-emotion. Monitoring, labeling, and appraising one's own emotional experience and regulation strategies. When someone is able to not sweat the small stuff, they're usually noticing the first flash of irritation, evaluating it. Is this worth it? Choosing a regulation strategy like reframing, letting go, or even just taking a breath. That noticing, evaluating, choosing sequence is metacognitive work applied to emotion regulation. Now, as for the anger loops as the metacognitive problem, this can be described as a regulation cycle where there is very little reflective monitoring and a lot of autopilot. A few metacognitive features of that loop would include low monitoring of internal state. They may not notice early cues like tension or rumination, only the full-blown anger. So they have no early exit from that loop. They may have rigid interpretations, thoughts like, people are always disrespecting me, or nothing ever goes right. These are taken as obvious truths rather than an interpretation that could be questioned. Good metacognition would flag those as perhaps distorted, but in an anger loop, they pass unchallenged. One might have overconfidence in one's appraisals. Research suggests that metacognitive bias, a tendency to be quite sure of one's judgment, can coexist with poor accuracy and deep rumination. In anger, this looks like, I know they did that on purpose, shutting down the possibility of alternative viewpoints. Inability to effectively adapt to and manage their environment or cope with challenges, creating conditioned responses to negative stimuli. People with weaker metacognitive ability tend to rely more on suppression, pushing feelings down, clenching, stonewalling, rather than flexible strategies like reappraisal or problem solving. Suppression often backfires and keeps the system primed, ready for that next trigger to hit even harder. Put simply, the loop is a self-regulation cycle with poor self-observation, rigid beliefs, and habitual strategies that never get reviewed or updated. This causes tiny triggers to feel huge and happens when there is a lot of unprocessed material, all of this stuff under the surface, chronic stress, past hurts, or unmet needs. So each small event is interpreted through the unexamined emotional backlog. The person is not asking meta questions like, what else might this mean? Or what is this really about for me? Or even, what is the lesson here? And how can I use this to benefit me? You remember that one? They interpret anger itself as justified and necessary. If I'm this mad, it must be serious. Instead of seeing it as a signal that may or may not fit the situation. By contrast, high metacognition allows someone to recognize my reaction is bigger than the situation. Something else in me is hurting or depleted, which can hopefully downshift the anger. So what does don't sweat the small stuff look like in metacognitive terms? Well, the phrase itself, don't sweat the small stuff, is a shorthand for a cluster of metacognitive skills, such as putting things in a time and scale perspective. Will this matter tomorrow? In a week? In a year? That's metacognitive evaluation of the significance of a trigger. Strategic review. When I blow up over this, does it actually improve my life or relationships? Well, that's evaluating the effectiveness of one's typical anger strategy. And always important, reframing. This is annoying, but also minor and maybe not personal. Thinking in this way is deliberately altering one's interpretation to shift the emotional response. People who look for reasons to get angry often are not consciously looking. They are running a script like, I must detect disrespect and react strongly, without noticing that this script is just one of many possible ways to relate to events. If you think about it for yourself, reframing it metacognitively can also shift how you relate to these types of people. You can see their anger as a deficit in self-monitoring and flexible regulation, not just a personality flaw. You can practice your own meta questions when you're around them. What story am I telling about their anger? Do I need to join their loop, or can I step out of it? That is you using metacognition to avoid getting pulled into their pattern. One simple metacognitive move you might try internally is, what's happening in my body and thoughts right now? And what response would actually serve me here? That single question shifts you from being in the emotional stream to standing on the bank looking at it, which is the essence of applying metacognition to emotion. Now, from a spiritual perspective, many spiritual traditions, in different ways of expressing this concept, emphasize becoming the witness or observer of the mind. Metacognition overlaps strongly with that. You shift from being fused with thoughts and emotions, I am angry, to relating to them as experiences arising in awareness. Anger is arising in me right now. This creates a small but powerful gap between stimulus and response, where choice, compassion, and wisdom can enter. Over time, living from this witness position can loosen the grip of ego stories. Who I must be, how life must go, and open into broader perspectives, interconnection, humility, gratitude, and a sense of meaning beyond your immediate reactions. Spiritual evolution here doesn't mean becoming above human reactions. It means becoming intimate with them without being totally identified with them. Metacognition is often the psychological side of that spiritual movement. It supports less reactivity, seeing a trigger as my wounded pattern instead of your fault. More compassion, recognizing that others are also acting from their unconscious patterns. More alignment, acting from what you value, love, truth, courage, instead of what you fear or habitually do. In many ways, metacognition is the practical way we actually live spiritual insights, rather than just agree with them intellectually. So let's talk about how you can practice observer mode in your daily life. If you want to strengthen this in a spiritual self-discovery direction, some simple practices are micro pauses. A few times a day, stop for 10, 20 seconds and ask, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? How is this affecting my body and behavior? Just notice without fixing. Naming the process, not just the content. My mind is thinking catastrophically. I'm rationalizing. I'm protecting myself by withdrawing. Instead of only, this is terrible or they are wrong. Gentle inquiry. When you notice a strong reaction, ask, what does this reaction seem to be trying to protect? What story about me or the world is underneath it? You can do a values check. Before acting on a strong emotion, ask, what do I want to be in this moment? What response would be aligned with that? All of these tools cultivate the observer who observes while staying grounded and compassionate rather than detached or judgmental. Now, one might ask the question, what is the origin of metacognition? Also, For those of you who are familiar with Carl Jung's notion of how the subconscious begins revealing itself to you, how does it relate to this psychological construct? So the term metacognition is modern, actually, and comes from psychology, but the experience it points to is much older and connects quite naturally with Jung's idea about the unconscious starting to show itself to consciousness. The word itself is built from meta, which is beyond or about, and cognition, which is thinking. So literally, beyond thinking or thinking about thinking. As a technical term in psychology, it was coined by the American developmental psychologist John H. Flavel in the early 1970s, building on his earlier work on metamemory. Flavel defined metacognition as knowledge about one's own cognitive processes and the active monitoring and regulation of those processes. For example, noticing that you learn one thing more easily than another, or deciding to double check something before accepting it as true. Now, as a named construct, metacognition is relatively recent, but reflections on knowing oneself and reflecting on one's own mind go back to at least to Greek and other ancient philosophies. So how does this link to Jung's unconscious? Jung's model says that much of our psyche is unconscious. Shadow material, complexes, instincts, and archetypal patterns that influence us without our knowing. Spiritual and psychological growth for Jung involves a process he called individuation, the gradual bringing of unconscious material into relationship with consciousness. By the way, this is the same spiritual principle involved in self-awareness and spiritual awakening. Metacognition in practice is one of the ways that bridge opens. When you observe your thoughts and reactions, such as I'm suddenly very irritated, this is more intense than the situation warrants. You are creating a stable, conscious standpoint from which unconscious material can be noticed. Repeated metacognitive noticing of strong, patterned reactions. For example, always feeling rejected in quite ordinary situations is often how people first encounter a complex, an emotionally charged cluster of memories, beliefs, and expectation in the Jungian sense. Jung emphasized paying attention to fantasies, slips, projections, and emotional overreaction as the places where the unconscious breaks into consciousness. Metacognition is the habit of catching those moments in real time and becoming curious instead of automatically acting them out. In that way, metacognition doesn't replace Jungian work, but it supports it. It trains you to see the seams where the unconscious touches everyday life. One way of synthesizing it is the modern term metacognition names the capacity to step outside your immediate stream of thought and emotion and observe, question, and guide it. Jung's language speaks of consciousness entering into dialogue with the unconscious, gradually integrating shadow and complexes into a more whole personality. When you practice metacognition with openness, noticing, naming, and inquiring into your inner life, you are enacting that Jungian dialogue, You become less identified with your immediate reactions and more available to what is trying to make itself known from below the surface. So how does all of this relate to our quest for spiritual awakening? Of understanding our divine nature and origin and realizing that we are more than our out-pictured illusory self, but are creating our own reality as spiritual beings having a human experience and creating our reality by virtue of our consciousness. Spiritual awakening in this description depends on one core shift, moving from being inside the stream of thoughts, roles, and stories to recognizing yourself as the aware presence in which all of that appears. Metacognition is a psychological doorway into that spiritual realization. So from metacognition to spiritual insight, metacognition starts as thinking about my thinking, but it ultimately deepens into something more. At first, you notice thoughts and emotions. I'm anxious. I'm telling myself a fearful story. With practice, you begin to sense, if I can observe these thoughts and emotions, then they can't be the deepest I. Eventually, the emphasis shifts from the contents, thoughts, feelings, images, to the space of awareness itself, the silent, observing presence that remains constant while everything in your experience changes. That movement from identification with content to identification with awareness is exactly what many traditions call awakening to your true nature. So, in seeing through the illusory self, the outpictured illusory self is largely made of conditioned stories about who you are. I'm valuable only if, or I'm this kind of person. Old emotional patterns and defenses, social masks and roles. Metacognition awareness lets you see all of these as constructs rather than ultimate truth. When you notice, here I am again playing the role of the fixer, or the victim, or the controller, you are already standing a little outside of it. The gap reveals that this identity is happening in me. It is not the entirety of me. Me is more like the field in which these identities arise and fade. This field language is one way of pointing toward what you describe as our divine nature. Not the small shifting person, but the luminous, aware presence that holds it all. So we're beginning to understand consciousness as our creative mechanism. If reality as you live it is shaped by consciousness, then becoming conscious of your own mind is the first step in reclaiming that creative power. When you are unconscious, old wounds and beliefs silently filter what you notice, what you expect, and how you act. You then read the world as confirming those filters. See, life is always like this, which reinforces the pattern. Metacognition breaks this loop by exposing the filter. I'm expecting rejection before anything has ever happened. You can then start allowing a new choice. What if I relate from openness instead of a preemptive defense? Over time, this changes what you notice, how people respond, and which possibilities you say yes to. In that sense, your reality really does begin to reorganize around a more awakened, less fear-driven consciousness. So again, spiritual being, human experience. You could think of it like this. As a human, you have thoughts, emotions, traumas, history, culture. Metacognition helps you navigate and heal this level with honesty and skill. As a spiritual being, you are the aware presence in which all of that unfolds. Metacognition matures into resting as that presence, not just observing from a distance, but recognizing this awareness is what I am. Then the human experience, including its pains and joys, can be seen as expressions within consciousness, not as something that defines or imprisons it. Life is still very real, but it's no longer the whole of who you are. It becomes a practical way to live. If you want to use all of this in service of awakening, you might integrate 3 layers. 1, observation. By regularly asking, what am I thinking and feeling right now? What story is running? 2, naming it gently. Fear is here. Pride is here. Or old shame is here. Number 3, inquiry. If I am aware of this, what is the I that is aware? What if this story is just one possible lens, not the truth of reality or of me? We need to practice resting as awareness. For short moments, don't fix or improve anything. Just notice the simple sense of being here, aware. Let thoughts, emotions, and sensations move inside that openness, like weather in the sky. Over time, this path can take you from improving the mind to directly tasting the fact that you are more than mind altogether. A spiritual presence temporarily expressing itself through a human life. So to summarize, metacognition and Jungian psychology connect most strongly around self-observation, integration of opposites, and the gradual shift from I am my thoughts to I am the awareness noticing my thoughts, which is exactly where many people locate spiritual awakening. In simple terms, metacognition is awareness of your own mind, noticing thoughts, emotions, and patterns, and deliberately choosing how to relate to them. As this awareness matures, experience starts to feel less automatic and more like something you can witness, reflect on, and shape. From Jung's view of the psyche, he saw the psyche as containing both the conscious ego and a vast unconscious full of archetypes, shadow, material, and symbolic imagery. Individuation, this term of psychological growth, is the process of bringing unconscious material into consciousness, reconciling inner opposites, and forming a more whole-centered self. Finally, how can this evolve into spiritual awareness? As you repeatedly notice your thoughts, complexes, and emotional storms, a stable inner observing position emerges. You recognize that awareness itself is deeper than any single thought or role. For many, this Disidentification from ego content feels spiritual. A sense of inner spaciousness, connection to something larger, Jung's self, the transpersonal or non-dual awareness, and a lived intuition that I am not just this small story of me. So, from psychology to awakening. In brief, you can think of it as a continuum. From metacognition, what am I thinking and feeling? And is it accurate or helpful? Through Jungian individuation, what is trying to come into consciousness from the unconscious? And how can I live more as a whole person? Finally, to spiritual awakening. What is this awareness that contains all of this? Thoughts, feelings, symbols, others, world, and is not limited to any of them. In that sense, metacognition is the everyday practice. Jung provides a symbolic and depth psychological framework. And spiritual awakening is what can emerge when sustained, honest witnessing and integration go on for long enough. So to all of you, I say, continue to be the observer. Continue to monitor your thoughts, feelings, patterns, and expressions. Do so from a non-judgmental perspective and allow yourself to feel unconditional love, both as self and also as an individual spark of the one, of all that is. Connect with your subconscious, your higher self. Understand that this is the part of you that holds the answers, that it is always there to guide you in the right way and direction, if you would only just listen. Stay in the now. Live in love. Take moments to just be. Rinse and repeat. We'll be talking more about these and other topics in future installments. And if there is anything that you would like for me to discuss, or any questions you may have about anything that I have shared, please feel free to mention it by leaving a question or a comment in the comments section. I read them all. As always, if you have found any of this information at all helpful or enlightening, please like, subscribe, and share with others. I continue to be thrilled to see so many new people coming into this space, and I truly appreciate those of you who are letting others know about this. I'm even more excited to see the growing number of souls awakening worldwide to this ongoing movement to a oneness consciousness. So in parting, I send you my love. And if we are one, let's all live in peace, love, and joy.